Welcome everyone to CAPI's first Lunch and Learn for 2011. It's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed leader of the Centre, Dr. Andrew Harding. Dr. Harding holds the position of director as well as CAPI's law chair, and he's a professor at the law school, comparative and constitutional expert with a huge focus on Southeast Asia. And as Bill Nielsen pointed out, his work on Thailand and the situation of constitutions has made great food for Andrew's numerous publications over the years.
Long way they continue.
So today we get to hear the search for perfect paper, Constitutions and Political Division in Thailand. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Helen. Let me start by explaining the title, which has a kind of a double meaning. It comes from a story that has circulated in Bangkok, that apparently there is an old lady who has a monopoly on the supply of the special paper that is used in the temples for religious purposes. It is on this very same paper that every time there is a new constitution in Thailand, the official version of the constitution is written. So the story goes that if you ever notice that this old lady is particularly busy, it means there's going to be a coup, because a coup necessarily has to have a new constitution, an interim constitution, in place at the right time. So everything needs to be prepared in advance. And so, you know, the story goes that the old lady is always busy because there's always going to be a coup in Thailand. So that's to explain. But of course, the other meaning of the search for perfect paper is the idea that by constantly revisiting the constitution and improving its various provisions, you can get to a point where you have something like a perfect constitution. I always think this is really not the point in Thailand, to keep revisiting the constitution, which they've now done on 18 occasions since 1932, and things don't seem to get very much better, unfortunately, although they did briefly during the late 90s and early 2000s, looking at it from a political and constitutional point of view. So that's just to explain the title. And here's what you all know about. And I'm sorry, you know, there are people here who probably know at least as much about Thailand as I do, and so this might be a bit boring for some of you. But you'll know about the crackdown that happened in May 2010. And here's some pictures from this. This picture with all the smoke has a particular irony for me, because back in 2007, I was discussing with an old friend of CAPI's, Dr. Jingjai, an old friend of Bill Nielsen's as well, the situation there, and the coup had happened in September 2006. And I asked him his opinion, and Jingjai said, well, you know, it's a bit like deciding to get rid of all the long grass in your garden by setting fire to it. It seems like a good, convenient way of getting rid of the grass, but the trouble is your house may catch fire as well. Well, what a prediction! That's exactly what happened in May 2010. So I'm going to try to explain how things came to this pass and where we go from here. This is the damage resulting from that particular episode. 90 people killed, more than 1,000 people injured. Obviously a lot of fire damage in a very sort of sensitive economically area of Bangkok, with a lot of political damage, and I would argue constitutional damage looking further ahead as well. So how did this come about? Who exactly are these reds and yellows that people talk about? What is the way forward? And where is the constitution in all this? How do we find a constitutional answer to the present situation? Obviously, as a constitutional law professor, that's one of my main concerns. Here is the sort of the history of the search for perfect paper, which makes some quite alarming reading. The coup against the absolute monarchy happened in 1932. Since then, there have been 18 constitutions, average duration 4.33 years, which is actually less than or about the life of an average parliament in Thailand. There have been 17 military coups, 55 governments. I think these figures are just about correct. And 28 prime ministers. Major constitutional reforms happened in 1997, and then, as you know, there was a military coup in September 2006. The latest constitution was brought into effect in August 2007. So the cycle seems to have continued, even though most people thought that the 1997 constitution had brought that kind of constitutional cycle finally to an end. It proved not to be the case. And in addition to 3 constitutions in force since 2006, there have been 4 governments as well. The current government has been in office for about 2 years, and Prime Minister Abhisit is already being called a veteran and a survivor, having been in office about as long as President Obama. But of course the king has reigned, actually it's not 61 years, it's 64 years, isn't it? No, it's 64 years, not 61 years, since he assumed the throne in 1946. So the king has been the only really constant element in the political and constitutional landscape over the last few decades. So what led to 1997 was the Black May incident of 1992, in which protesters were shot by the military government. A constitutional reform process, which was very impressive, took place over the subsequent 5 years. The Constitution was drafted. The economic crisis then hit in the middle of 1997, interestingly, just as the bringing into effect of approval of the Constitution was being discussed. The reform process was supported very strongly by the business classes and middle classes in Bangkok, in spite of the economic situation, and it then came into effect. This was the idea of the 1997 Constitution. It was to provide a final solution to this cycle of elections, coalition governments that were then dismissed one way or another due to corruption, military coups, followed by a new constitution, which was usually an interim constitution, followed by a permanent constitution. So about 7 of the 18 constitutions have actually been interim constitutions. One of those was actually in effect for about 10 years, so it wasn't really an interim constitution. On the other hand, the permanent constitutions have not tended to last very long. By those standards, the 1997 Constitution, in force for 9 years, was actually, quite a significant period of time in the Thai context. So the idea was to provide for stable government, to get the military out of politics, back into the barracks, to entrench the rule of law, human rights, good governance, and so on, provide trenchant and anti-corruption measures. And the idea was to do this by creating a whole range of new independent agencies or watchdog bodies whose independence would be guaranteed by the government. That is a task which has sort of been partially successful and partly unsuccessful over the last few years. Well, then, of course, this man, Thaksin Shinawatra, came into office as Prime Minister at the beginning of 2001. And I think this picture is quite good because it captures the political scientists' analysis of what they call entourage politics in Thailand. The idea of special relationships, of a sort of patron-client nature. And there you can see Thaksin with his entourage. So the Constitution was smoothly implemented for a few years. All the organic laws that were necessary were passed against quite tight deadlines. And then Thaksin's Thai party was elected. Now at that time, interestingly enough, Thaksin was already under the cloud of a corruption allegation, which had been, he'd been actually found to have breached the rules on declaration of assets by the Anti-Corruption Commission. And the case then went up to the Constitutional Court just after Thaksin became Prime Minister. and they decided by the narrowest possible margin of 8 to 7 that he was not guilty. And if he had been found guilty, he would have been red carded. They use soccer terms for this in Thailand. Nothing to do with Thaksin's ownership of Manchester City or anything like that, but he used this red card. He would have been disqualified for 5 years if that decision had been made just one vote the other way. Now, there were lots of problems with Thaksin's government in terms of people objecting to some of the things that he had done. In actual fact, it was a mixed picture. There were some pretty horrendous things, but there were also some quite good things that he did. But crucially, it was his involvement in the decision to sell one of Thailand's largest companies, his own family company, Shin Corporation, to Temasek Holdings, which is a government-linked company in Singapore, at a profit of $1.9 billion, which somehow escaped having any capital gains tax levied on it. And it was really this event, rather than, for example, things that had happened in the south of Thailand with the insurgency and so on, that brought huge numbers of people out onto the streets to protest against Thaksin's government. So this is really the origin of the red-yellow split. The people protesting were people we would now call the yellow shirt faction, and the people protesting in favour of Thaksin are what we would now call the red shirt faction. So who exactly are these people? Now, this is going to be a bit of an oversimplification. And I'm aware there are lots of sort of subtleties and subtext to this description, but basically the yellow shirts are seen to be mainly middle-class people, mainly living in Bangkok and the south of Thailand, and are great supporters of the king and are anti-Thaksin. That's a basic description of the yellow shirts. This is probably uncontroversial, but the description of the red shirts is a little bit more difficult. Oh, sorry, I thought we were coming on to those, but apparently not. The anti-Thaksin movement was the yellow shirt protest. They protested against human rights abuses. What's very important in the Thai context is not to offend or to be accused of offending the king. And so the yellow shirts see themselves in a way as defenders of the monarchy and of the king against Thaksin. It's very far from clear that there's any real sense in which Thaksin himself is anti-monarchist, but he's accused of having a secret desire to set up a republic. That was something that happened during his premiership. These protests were so intense that Thaksin called for a snap election in April 2006, which was boycotted by the opposition parties. Following the King's intervention in this episode, the Constitutional Court then ruled that election to be invalid, and Thaksin announced plans to hold a new election later in 2006. He continued as a caretaker prime minister, but he didn't give any indication of when he would step down. He said loosely that he would step down following the election, even if his party won the election. But you sort of suspect that nobody really quite believed what he said. And then, of course, in September, while all this was still under discussion, the coup d'etat happened while Thaksin was out of the country. He made the crucial mistake of leaving the country at a sensitive time and exposed his rear to a military coup in his absence. So General Sonti took over as the leader of the coup group, and here's a picture that was taken actually by UVic grad Chandler Vandergrift in Bangkok in 2006, which I think is neat because it shows the democracy monument with the soldiers in silhouette in front of it. So this was perfect paper is the democracy monument, but it was ranged against tanks. the coup had abolished the constitution, dismissed the government, dismissed the Senate and Parliament, so the usual process was gone through. The old lady trundled out her paper and an interim constitution was passed, providing for the drafting of a new permanent constitution in 2007. Now, apparently 80% of people in Bangkok, at any rate, supported the coup, but of course you'll understand that a lot of people outside Bangkok didn't support the coup, so we don't really know what the position was over the whole of Thailand. But those were the stated reasons, for carrying out this coup. This is pro forma. I mean, this is what they say every time there is a coup. A justification of this kind is given. One of the amusing things about this, I think, was that when they took over, the military headed, as you do, towards the television station to announce the happening of a coup, and they actually went to a life insurance building instead, so they found themselves in the wrong place. So, they hadn't done their plans quite as carefully as perhaps they should have done. As usually happens, the interim constitution provided for immunity for the coup group, and that's confirmed in the 2007 constitution. And this, in a way, is the secret why there are so many constitutions in Thailand, because in order to secure immunity, you actually have to overthrow the constitutional order completely. The question might be, well, why do you need to do that? I mean, in other countries, they have a sort of a deviation or something of that kind. Why do you need a completely new constitution? Well, this is the very reason, to protect the coup leaders from any legal consequences of their actions. So this is the process that led to the 2007 constitution, very much distinct from the 1997 process. This was very much under the control of the military all the way through. And in some respects, but not others, the 2007 constitution went back to some of the principles that had applied before the 1997 constitution. One of the explanations, incidentally, for 1997 is that the constitution-making process somehow fell out of the control of the government of the time. And this was the only time in Thailand's history where that process had not been under the control of the government or the regime in power at the time. But 2007 reverted to type in that respect. But having said that, I mean, there were some improvements. The paper was rendered a little bit more perfect in some respects compared with the 1997 constitution. But the point is that the 2007 constitution doesn't really enjoy any legitimacy. I mean, whatever people might think about the worthiness or otherwise of its actual provisions, it's seen by the red shirts as the fruit of a poisoned tree. That's Thaksin's own words, because of the coup and the military-installed government that supervised the process of the drafting of the constitution. So it's not become really an issue of which is the more perfect piece of paper. It's really which side are you on in this particular struggle that really matters. So the elections led to a Thaksin-leaning government which took office at the beginning of 2008. And this was kind of interesting because the whole point of the coup had been to get rid of a Thaksin government. And yet the process following the coup led to the installation of a Thaksin-leaning government within about 15 or 16 months of the coup. So in that sense, the coup, although a drastic measure, was totally ineffective to achieve what it was designed to achieve. So the yellow shirts came out to protest again during 2008. It was a bit difficult to discover what the basis of their protest was because they never actually mentioned anything that the government did during 2008. Their case came down to saying, we don't like the Prime Minister's brother-in-law or the Prime Minister's associate, being Thaksin, of course. That was really the sole ground for their objection. Two constitutional court decisions during 2008 then proceeded to oust Thaksin prime ministers from office in a sort of process that looks a bit like a judicial version of a military coup. Here's the yellow shirts protesting in the airport, and here's this extraordinary episode where the Constitutional Court found that the first of these prime ministers, Samak, was guilty of contravening the rules on conflict of interest because he had been running a cookery show on a television channel. I mean, on the scale of corruption in Thailand, I mean, this would scarcely register. In fact, most people would say, well, that's a jolly good thing too, you know, rather than saying this is kind of evidence of deep corruption. So it seems like they were scrabbling around for some kind of excuse to get rid of Samak. So this is now late 2008. The yellow shirt protests continued. They occupied the second Prime Minister Somchai's office and the airport, and then eventually the Constitutional Court dissolved the PPP party, which Somchai was heading. Somchai is over here, which led by a strange process to the present government taking office. Well, okay, who are the red shirts in all this? They had been keeping pretty quiet during 2008 because their heroes were in power at that point, but obviously they've been very active ever since the present government under Abhisit came into office in early 2009. Well, mainly farmers and workers as opposed to the middle classes, mainly from the north and east of Thailand rather than from Bangkok and the south. And mainly pro-taxing, with a sort of a very extreme element within the red shirts that perhaps would like to see the overthrow of the entire Bangkok elite, possibly even including the monarchy itself. But a lot of ink has been expended on how you actually analyse the red shirt movement, and things have become even more confused now that the red shirts have been sort of dispersed as a result of the crackdown. So there are as many theories as there are people on this particular question. The official position is, of course, that the red shirts don't really exist anymore. But in fact, during the last few days, they have come out once again in Bangkok itself to mount relatively modest protests. But of course, their leaders are now very much in jail as a result of the crackdown. So it's really quite difficult to see where, if anywhere, the red shirt movement is now heading. But any idea that it doesn't exist or it's gone away, I think simply has to be false. But whatever shape it takes might be a little more difficult to answer. So going back to the beginning of 2009, it was a defection of a red faction of one party to the Democrats that put Abhisit in power 2 years ago. Now, the point about this, of course, as the red shirts have pointed out ever since then, is that Abhisit and the Democrats came into power without an election. So this explains another reason for hostility to the 2007 Constitution is that it is blamed for this phenomenon of a government, which they really dislike, taking power without an election. So this time, the protesters have come out with a very specific demand. They're demanding democracy, and they're demanding to have an election. So much of the debate has been around, when and under what circumstances would an election be held, and that Abhisit has kind of come down to say that an election would be held during 2011, probably earlier rather than later during this year. But we obviously, wait and see what happens about that. So this was the background to the crackdown. The red shirt faction had been protesting all the way through since January 2009. It was in particular another court decision stripping Thaksin of half his assets that sparked the particular mass protest in April and May 2010 that resulted in the crackdown. And basically the red shirts occupied about 20 blocks of downtown shopping area in Bangkok and some adjacent areas for quite some considerable time, a few weeks before the decision was ultimately taken to send in the military to disperse them. Now there's an interesting point here about the crackdown, which is that it seems very clear that there are some elements in the military that are actually red faction supporters. The military is not necessarily 100% in favour of the yellow shirt persuasion. And one consequence of that is that the protesters were able to get their hands on some grenade launchers that were used during the protests, and things obviously got very nasty, and several people were killed. Sometimes there were completely innocent people who just happened to be in the area and weren't really anything to do with the protest. So this is a somewhat alarming aspect that leads some scholars, for example, there's a handout with a one-page extract from an article by Paul Chambers. Paul Chambers is one who's saying that Thailand is in grave danger of civil war at the present time, largely as a result of this episode. So where do we go from here? Now, the red shirt leadership has been jailed. The red shirt protests seem to have reappeared. There's going to be an election, but obviously there is a danger of a repetition of history here. So obviously all eyes are on the question, well, who is going to win the next election? Because if a red shirt party or combination of parties wins the election, and it's expected that those parties would take government, then one can imagine some measures being taken to try and trump or counteract that election result, which would be obviously very bad news for democracy, but it would be true to form in terms of what's been happening in the last few years. I mean, would there, for example, be another military coup, or would there be further constitutional court decisions making it impossible for the government to continue, or what exactly is going to happen? On the other hand, one body of opinion says that because a lot of people were disgusted by the protests of the red shirts during 2010, that they actually lost a lot of electoral support. And last time I was in Bangkok, there was actually a by-election going along in Bangkok, which was won by the Democrats, the yellow shirt people, by a landslide. But of course, that was in Bangkok, and it may not look the same from Chiang Mai, where Nata comes from. Interestingly enough, it seems there has been some research carried out in the north of Thailand to ascertain what people's political opinions are, roughly during the present time. And surprisingly, I don't know if this was a neutral survey, but it came up with the result that red and yellow shirt supporters were about in equal measure, even around the Chiang Mai area, with most people not having an allegiance either way. So, it may be that the situation is more fluid and more uncertain than one gets, than the picture one gets from a number of scholars looking at this. Now, the severance of politics is really the idea that somehow you can use constitutional measures to regulate the behavior of political parties and politicians. And that's why there is this kind of obsession with perfect paper in Thailand, even though I've said that it's not the point. There's obviously a lot of people who do think it's the point in Thailand. So it'd be interesting to see how this factor plays. One can't help thinking that, politics is going to have its way anyway, however constitution makers or officials try to regulate the conduct of political parties and politicians. One thing that has to go is this idea that the Constitutional Court can simply dissolve political parties because they have been involved in vote buying or some other electoral malpractice. Because that is both divisive and drastic, but it's also completely ineffective because the party concerned just sets itself up again under a different name, and the technique is that they're now actually waiting for these decisions so they can proceed with their party immediately a court decision comes out. So that simply has to go, I think. There is this issue of the divided military that Paul Chambers discusses, and there is also discussion about constitutional amendments, so the search for perfect paper is still continuing. Well, okay, now here's two views that I've seen about the whole idea of constitutions in Thailand. I mean, should we kind of dismiss these constitutions as merely being the paper which shores up the legitimacy of the regime that happens to be in power, or is there more to it than that? I think there's a lot in the second view here, that one can see progress from constitution to constitution in several respects. However, obviously, the present situation has clouded that, and some means needs to be found of getting beyond the acute polarization, avoiding civil war, and seeing if there can be constitutional progress in future. So this is my view. It's the perfection of constitutional politics that should be sought, not the perfection of the paper itself. The aim should be on both sides for compromise rather than total victory. There doesn't seem to be much of an idea of compromise, but only of using politics and the Constitution in order to achieve total victory over the other side, and that, I think, is a mistake. So there needs to be some sort of agreement on the Constitution. The red shirts would like to go back to 1997, and there's a lot in that view because 1997 was one of the few positive experiences in constitutional terms that Thailand has seen. But obviously the issue is that you might get agreement on some issues, that's going to be difficult enough, but then actually sticking to the agreement, sticking to the rules is really the big problem. I'm put in mind of what a former president of Peru said when he said, in Peru we have many good laws, but what we lack is the law that says that all the other laws should be obeyed. And I think that's actually quite a good description in some ways of what's been happening in Thailand. The law has been, and the constitution have been seen as mechanisms to achieve one's own objective rather than as neutral positions that people should comply with. So somehow that situation has got to be reached. And there's the, I think, rather nice cover design of the book, in which you can find out a lot more about, hopefully, about some of these issues, which is due out in April 2011. So that's how I've been spending my time when I've not been directing CAPI over the last couple of years. So that's basically it.